Hello. This is the reading of Life, Death, and In Between by Saturday Night Frights, and read by Poltergeist. This is a Danny Phantom and DCU crossover fic. The rating is mature, and some tags include Danny and Damien are twins, Homeless Danny, and Ghost King Danny. I'd also like to add that this fic can get a little bit graphic, so be warned. This is also a gen fic, meaning there won't be any particular focus on any romantic relationships. And so, without further ado, please enjoy the fic. Here's the summary. Injured, alone, and terrified, Danny flees to an unfamiliar city. He's hoping to disappear amongst the high percentage of homeless youth, become just one face in the crowd, heal the anonymity Gotham provides. He doesn't expect to be found. Or, another DC fanfic where Danny and Damien are long-lost twins. Danny suffers, Damien is angry, and Bruce adds to the Wayne family, hey, it doesn't count as adoption if they're both your blood son. Book 1. The Heir, the Spare. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. Friedrich Nietzsche. Danny had barely managed to phase through the walls of the building before he was slamming into the floor of the darkened classroom. His transformation shuddered over his wrecked body with a faint white light, leaving a broken and bloody teenage boy gasping on the ground. The wailing of a siren echoed in his ears, drowned out only by the thudding of his heartbeat. He heaved himself to his feet, one shaky hand coming up to clutch at his stomach. The boy stumbled to the desk at the front of the room, fumbling for the red stapler on the desktop. Danny held it in one trembling hand as the other slowly pushed up his damp shirt, exposing the bloody horror of his abdomen. The boy held his soaked shirt, drenched in rain and too much blood, between his teeth, holding it in place for what he was about to do, what he had to do. He pinched his blood-slick skin, pressing the two sides of the surgical cut together. Then he took a deep breath and clenched his eyes shut, trying to move fast enough that he couldn't second-guess or psych himself out. His breath came quicker as he pressed the cold metal against his torso, and a staple bit harshly into the tender skin of his stomach. 1. They had been waiting for him, had likely tracked his movements for days to determine a pattern, to decide the right moment to strike. He should have noticed, should have seen the writing on the wall as things changed, the quiet before the storm. Life had been quiet in the weeks following the incident, his defeat of Pariah Dark, peaceful, even. Danny had grown complacent in the decrease of spectral attacks and absence of concerns regarding his parents, had believed his life, afterlife, was changing for the better. He should have known, should have known, should have known. How could he have known? It had happened so fast, of course it did. They had moved with military precision, using his parents' weapons and equipment against him, trapping him like an animal. The staple shook in his hand as he moved it up to his stomach, pressing it in again. 2. Somewhere in the mess of constant noise, he missed the most important detail. He hadn't forgotten, rather overlooked, placed trust in a space where it did not fit and could not belong. He should never have let her go. His subjects, his decisions, his responsibility, his fault. It was not her fault, would never be her fault. She did not have his training, could not have expected to hold up under. She hadn't broken. He had been so proud, the feeling shining in his core through the anguish, had never once faltered. It was just that. She couldn't help what she was. Silence in the face of unprovoked torment was useless when they could reach the secrets hidden in your very DNA. They'd known what to look for, and had figured him out. And Ellie. Danny didn't know if it was his tears or rain that tracked down his face. He pushed through, counting each staple that held him together, each bite of metal cold against his burning flesh. Even with the rain pounding against the windows, Danny's muffled cry sounded impossibly loud. Hours, days, weeks of strategically inflicted pain didn't mean that an office stapler didn't hurt as much as it held his wound closed. The stapler pressed firmly into his sternum at the intersection of the Y-shaped incision, the surgical cut, they had said, as if anything that had done to him had been medical in nature. One final bit of wire punched into his right side, flush against his collarbone. Danny slid down the wall. The stapler fell from his hand and hit the ground with a clatter. He supposed he should be relieved to be in his human form. The horrors inflicted on his ghostly form didn't exactly translate over, meaning that his wounds in this form, although severe, likely wouldn't be too much of a hindrance. He could manage. Maybe. He pushed his wet hair out of his face with one pale, trembling hand, wincing as the movement stretched his skin uncomfortably around the staples. Chilled rainwater dripped from the strands onto his shoulders and down his neck. Dead, the cold didn't even register to him. Alive, the slide of water down the nape of his neck served to ground him in his body, giving Danny a sensation to focus on other than pain. Pain. Sharp, burning, lingering, and lasting pain that ached with every breath and movement he made. Danny let loose a breath and sat with a preternatural stillness, the stillness that belonged only to the dead, as his chest neither rose nor fell. He stared idly at the spatter of ectoplasmic blood that slowly ate holes into the linoleum, letting the steady drum of the rain lull his mind into a state of meditative calm. Danny could do nothing but watch, do nothing but try to move his consciousness to a place where he couldn't feel the pain as keenly. He couldn't stop the guys in white from kidnapping him, couldn't prevent them from capturing other ghosts. He couldn't stop them from the experiments, couldn't answer the pleading cries that haunted his every waking moment. Danny couldn't stop them from taking Ellie away from him forever. He did not feel like a king. He felt small and insignificant and scared. He felt like the child he was. Danny closed his eyes. Quiet your thoughts, Gulby, and focus. There's much beyond what you can control. Pay attention to the things you can. It does not do you well to dwell on the past. Danny sniffed, pushing the events of the past few months into the furthest corner of his mind, packaging them up in a box, tied neatly with a bow. One day, he would be able to think back on those horrid memories, would be able to pull them out, hold them in hand, and turn them around to view from every angle. One day, he'd be able to do so without feeling a phantom ache within his core. One day, but today, he had to focus himself, and that had to be enough. It was all he could do. Amity was not safe. Not for any ghost, and not for Danny. Not anymore. Before his capture, the guys in white had placed an enforced quarantine on the entire town and its inhabitants, complete with a media blackout with firewalls so thick Tucker couldn't crack through them. No one could exit Amity without being cleared as a non-spectral entity, and no one entered. Which was fine, back when he'd thought of them as a mild irritation rather than the threat they really were. To show back up in Amity as Daniel Fenton, he would be better off just immediately turning himself back over to them. There would be no help for him in Amity, because Danny was alone, in a way he had never been before. Growing up, he had his brother. Pitted against each other and held in a state of constant competition aside, he had him. He had the reassurance that there was someone who could back Danny up no matter what. Then they'd been separated. But that was fine too. Because then there was Jazz and the doctor's Fenton. They had brought him up to some semblance of normalcy and an actual childhood. Sam and Tucker beside him when he became something more and less than human. Fighting and learning with him every step of the way. Eventually, Mom and Dad joined alongside Jazz in knowing and supporting. He had wondered why he had ever doubted them to begin with. Too caught up in trying to be a son he always thought they wanted. He hadn't realized they loved him for being the son they had. Jasmine, his sweet sister, his only sister, who insisted on holding his hand when she took him to the park for the first time, when they crossed the road, when they walked to school in the mornings. Jasmine, who made breakfast and dinner and got both of them to school. Jazz, who made her parents learn Danny's mother tongue so he could feel more at home, who sat with him when he wouldn't talk, wouldn't move. Jazz, who devoured every parenting and psychology book in an attempt to cover all the areas their parents fell short. Danny thought of her in moments of silence. When he was left alone at night, skin flayed and pinned to a dissection table, his cracked ribs slowly and achingly moving to cover up what they had tried to dig out, the itching, burning pain of organs regenerated. Danny thought about his sister to distract himself, reassure himself that even if their family was destroyed, at least Jazz was safe. She had been with her aunt. Touring some campus Danny teased her was in the middle of nowhere, but Jazz insisted was just a safety net choice. Maddie's sister offered to accompany the 17-year-old to various other campus tours in the beginning of June, all under the pretext that the mandatory 2-week quarantine to leave Amity was too short for Jazz to undergo more than once this summer. Maddie had assured her daughter that, really, Alicia desperately wanted some aunt-niece bonding time, had told Jazz to enjoy the summer, her last one before senior year, and college applications clouded her mind too much. So Jazz hadn't been home and Fenton Works went up in flames. When their parents hurriedly closed the portal to the ghost zone, the sudden void in energy creating a sucking vortex that imploded the laboratory, taking Maddie and Jack Fenton with it. What followed was a series of small explosions in the upper levels, until the whole unit was burning, trapping some unfortunate ghosts on the side of their living, and allowing the guys in white to legally declare the death of Jack, Maddie, and Daniel Fenton. He wondered if she knew yet what had happened. A crack of lightning lit up the empty classroom and brought Danny back to his current reality. At the moment, he knew for certain 3 things about his situation. Number 1, he couldn't stay anywhere within a 50-mile radius of Amity, Illinois. Despite calling the small town home for the past 7 years, he could never return. The GIW had a place under extreme lockdown, apparently government sanctioned. He would be found and returned to that 2-white room where they tore him apart slowly. With the lockdown and the media blackout, he couldn't even call for help. Wouldn't dare to place Sam or Tucker or even Valerie in danger. Not when he'd already lost his parents. Which brought him to the point number 2. Number 2, he was alone. Living under the identity of Danny Fenton had offered him a great degree of comfort that he hadn't taken for granted. Security, familiarity, and accompanied by adults who didn't want to harm him. Now, Danny was alone, unable to contact his friends or sister out of fear, in abject exile from the ghost zone, without access to his parents' portal or his own abilities. He was alone, without anyone to help him. Number 3, he desperately needed help because he was injured. Danny's phantom form had been brutalized to the point of near destabilization. For the first time in a long time, Danny was powerless and exceedingly vulnerable. After all, Danny shuddered at the memories that started to flood up, then winced at the sudden movement. Right, staples. No moving. He could deal with certain mental trauma when he wasn't in danger of being dragged back to a laboratory. Right now, he needed to figure out where to go, where he would be unseen, unnoticed, forgotten, just another kid on the streets. A memory floated to the forefront of his mind, Sam, of something she had once campaigned for. There are 3 cities that have an incredible rate of homeless youth. 3, you guys, Sam ranted, waving her hand around in frantic gestures. She shook her poster board in Danny and Tucker's faces. San Jose has the highest number of youths ages 18 to 24. Portland has the highest number of runaways, but the worst offender, the one with the most kids under 18 living on the streets, is Gotham, Danny said aloud breathlessly. In Gotham, Danny could fade away into the background. Just another unfortunate youth on the streets. In Gotham, Danny could disappear. Thank you, Sam, for your various social justice crusades. Danny slowly pulled himself to his feet, stumbling as he made his way towards the classroom door. The frantic flight from that underground laboratory had his sense of direction slightly skewered, but he knew one thing for certain. They had taken him out of Amity, given him access to the town with working public transportation, which meant he could take the bus the fuck out of Illinois. Danny had found his current clothes in a pile of strangers' missing items. A stuffed bunny, a left shoe, several sweatshirts, and a pair of trousers that smelled slightly of urine. He picked out the cleanest hooded sweatshirt and a pair of drawstring pants. They vanished at his touch. Neither fit properly, but they worked far better than his prior damp, bloody clothes, abandoned in the filthy bus station bathroom. Invisibility had been one of his first ghostly abilities to show, and now it was the only one he had access to. At least it was useful. Not that his intangibility, flight, or banshee screech were useless. Just not ideal when he was worried his organs were about to fall out. Invisibility to hide from human eyes in plain sight was much more useful for Danny at the moment. He shifted slightly in the harsh plastic chair, wincing as a crack pinched his back. Danny watched at the red numbers of the digital clock flickered. 4:03 a.m. The bus he waited for was late, and the attendant seemed unconcerned, flipping lazily through a magazine, the only sound beside the occasional coughing from what looked like a lump of blankets in the corner. Danny was one of only 5 possible bus riders, but still, he maintained his invisibility. It pulled at him, trembling like an overworked muscle. He could not allow himself to drop it, had allowed himself to rest in a bathroom, but he wouldn't risk it with the bus arriving so soon. If only it would hurry up. A ding echoed in the near empty station. The attendant looked up, heaving a world-weary sigh as he leaned into a small microphone, his voice crackling over the intercom. Carbondale to Gateway Station, arriving now. Carbondale to Gateway Station, arriving now. An older teen with half-shaved pink hair rose from her chair, followed closely by an elderly man. They rolled luggage behind them as they lined up behind a white taped line. Danny followed them, or on silent, invisible feet, sneaking onto the bus as the driver loaded their luggage. He edged around the few other passengers, collapsing into a seat at the back of the bus. waiting until the bus was pulling onto the highway to allow himself to fade back into visibility with a sigh. Danny curled his hand around the stapler in his hoodie pocket, resting his head against the cool glass. He watched the highway lights flash in the dark of the early morning as they drove past. The station had a large, faded map displayed with flickering light, showing major bus routes across the northeastern United States. Carbondale to St. Louis to Pittsburgh to Newark, and Newark to Gotham. Danny closed his eyes, pushing past the aches and pains of his body, and tried to rest. Soon, he'd be out of reach of the GIW. Hopefully. Danny stepped off the bus with a soft grunt, right arm wrapped tightly around his abdomen. The air in Gotham City was dense, heavy with a consistent fog that mingled with an unnerving sense of unease and surprisingly large amount of atmospheric ectoplasm. He hadn't realized how much his body had come to rely on the thick atmospheric ectoplasm in Amity, not until he had been in several different states and cities, where the amount of ectoplasm in the air was incredibly minimal. In Gotham, Danny felt like he could breathe again. He imagined it was a sentiment that was very few shared. Without his usual assortment of powers, he felt as unstable as those initial few weeks, the only difference being a modicum of greater control. Until his core could fully heal, he'd be stuck as little more than a metahuman. Danny had thought he was afraid of getting stuck in ghost form. Getting stuck in human form was proving to be just as suffocating. A reaching, too-big form crammed into a small container, which felt cracked and warped. Danny pulled his hood up over his head as a light drizzle started. The 15-year-old ambled along in the shadows, cast by the towering skyscrapers. He hunched in his shoulders, making himself smaller. Blue eyes stared out from under his hood, noting all those who came a little too close. Danny grimaced as a slight breeze caused his shirt to brush irritatingly against his wounds. It stuck in a few areas where fresh blood had seeped out from between his new staples. The most recent batch, applied earlier that morning when Danny woke to find the previous ones had, once again, disintegrated after prolonged exposure to his toxic blood. Danny tucked himself into an alcove in order to check his map. It was a tattered yellow thing that he had snatched up from the latest bus station. Hopefully, it was still depicted in Gotham City in a semi-reliable way, although, considering the destruction the city had faced at the hands of various villains, well, he wasn't very optimistic. Still, he had arrived in his destination city. Step 1 out of Danny Avoids the Government plan was complete. The next step would be locating a semi-reliable place to stay. In the time he had known her, Sam had enlisted Danny in distributing and displaying pamphlets and flyers on various issues. Keeping those memories in mind, Danny was putting most of his hope on the idea that the best place for resources would be the library. If it turned out Gotham City Public Library didn't have readily available information on homeless or youth shelters, well, it would likely have public access computers that Danny could use. Therefore, he figured the public library was overall his best bet on figuring out the details of his next step. Danny's thumb brushed against the location of the library on his map. He considered it, glancing up at the name of the street he was on, before pocketing the map. Danny slowly made his way through the city, skirting no less than 5 instances that Danny was fairly certain related to an extremely illegal or dangerous activities. Gotham, crime capital of the world. It started pouring rain by the time Danny arrived at the cracked marble steps of the Gotham Library. People began quickly vanishing from sight as they rushed out of the rain. This left Danny alone before the steps, brushing water from his eyes. He squinted at the Gothic-styled building, hazy behind the sheet of rain. Danny carefully made his way up the steps, careful not to move too quickly. With his luck, he'd slip and rip open his poorly stapled wounds. Gotham Public Library was, predictably, nearly silent, save for the turning of pages and hushed whispers of conversations. Danny could just barely make out with his enhanced hearing. It was also bigger than he had anticipated. Being used to the tiny library of Amity's only high school meant that the 3-story city library before him was immensely awe-inspiring. Despite Lancer's apparent beliefs about him, Danny did enjoy reading and learning. It's just that his ex-English teacher turned even the most interesting novels into a boring lesson. He stood in the entryway of the library, dripping water onto the marble floor. Danny's mouth parched slightly as he surveyed the massive space in between them. Perhaps, when he's not soaking wet, he would come back here, lose himself in a book, and forget that he was alone, twice orphaned and barely human. Blue eyes flickered to the right, where the librarian's desk was neatly pressed against the far wall, seeming to wrap around to a side Danny couldn't fully see from his position. A pretty red-haired librarian sat behind the desk. His heart squeezed as he was reminded of Jazz. He missed his sister. He pushed himself to invisibility, spectral muscles cramping in protest. Danny inched closer to the desk, spying various pamphlets stacked around it. He grabbed a few that looked particularly useful, while the librarian's attention was focused on another guest. He hurried back outside, sitting on a bench set off to the side of the front doors. Danny was not embarrassed about his current situation, yet the familiarity of the librarian to his sister made him want to hide away. A shameful blush creeped up his neck. She wasn't Jazz, but the similarity in hair color made him think how disappointed his sister would be with him, all her hard work, and Danny still hadn't ended up on the street. He snorted as he flickered through the pamphlets. Salvation Army, Soup Kitchen, Harvest House, Youth Shelter. Danny lingered on the shiny image of happy children printed against the last pamphlet. He brushed his fingers along the edge before flipping it open to get a closer read. Of all the options presented before him, surely a youth shelter was the best option. At 15, he was still legally a child. It would be another 3 years before he was considered an adult by anyone. 1 year before he could legally get a job, despite the complete upheaval of his life had recently undergone. Danny still wanted to at least graduate high school. The youth shelter seemed the best option, especially given his age. He was unfamiliar with how bad Gotham's foster system was. But even if the shelter forcibly placed him with a family, well, one more way to disappear. With that in mind, Danny set off in the direction of the youth shelter, following the little map printed on the back of his pamphlet, cheerfully stating, "You are here," where the library was. He glanced up at the darkening sky. If he hurried, he may make it before nightfall. Danny did not reach the shelter before nightfall. To further rub salt in the wound, every step he took seemed to urge the rain to fall heavier and harder. Much to his chagrin, he was fairly certain that the last few minutes had been falling of hail instead of rain. Given that it was mid-August New Jersey, Danny grit his teeth and cursed out whatever weather-altering villain was responsible for the sudden drop on temperature. His luck did seem to change upon arriving at the youth shelter. He was greeted by a portly, older woman who grasped at his bedraggled appearance with all but dragged him inside. She introduced herself as Sandy, the main nighttime caretaker of the shelter, which was apparently open 24/7. With all the care and ferocity of a determined grandmother, Sandy had him showered, in clean clothes, and with a hot bowl of soup within an hour. The woman was so determined to help that Danny was afraid she'd strip him of his clothes and wash him herself. As it was, currently, he was sat at an empty table, watching Sandy huff and run back and forth, muttering to herself about getting bed ready. Danny dropped his gaze and stared at the bowl of soup between his hands. Tomato. With a side of mouth-watering garlic bread that probably had been better hours before it was fresh. The warmth was against his cold skin. Maybe it would warm him to a temperature more suiting to a living human. He slowly ate, and used the soup as an excuse to remain silent. When Sandy finally sat at the table with him, Danny didn't actually have a need to eat. Mostly, eating was habitual, something he enjoyed rather than needed, a comfort in the same way breathing was. It also offered a welcome excuse to not answer Sandy's gently prodding questions. "Won't you tell me your name?" she asked in a soft, whispery voice. Her brown eyes were so warm, so genuinely concerned. He felt bad about the bare minimum information he was about to give. Danny swallowed a mouthful of tomato soup before speaking up to an equally quiet tone. "It's Danny," he said. Sandy smiled warmly and gently patted his hand closest to her. "I'm glad you're here, Danny. You did a very brave thing coming here. We're going to do all we can to help." Sandy's smile turned a bit sad as she continued, "All children deserve to feel safe and loved, Danny." When he had eaten what Sandy seemed to believe was an appropriate amount, he followed her to a bare room with 3 empty bunk beds, the one on the bottom far left being the only one prepared for someone to sleep on it. She sighed as she flicked on the light. "We don't get many children willingly coming here, Gotham being what it is." She watched Danny as he walked into the room towards the made bed. He sat on it and turned intense blue eyes towards Sandy. "Well," she clapped her hands, "I hope you have a decent night's sleep, dear. We do serve breakfast at 7, and our social worker will be by at 9. At this, Sandy gave Danny a stern look and wagged her finger towards him. "Now, don't go running off before 9. I'd hate to have the authorities called in to look for you, and it's important to get you in the system." Sandy huffed and turned off the light, wishing Danny a good night as she walked away. He had no intention of running, not at the moment. He He also had no intention of being 100% truthful with the social worker. The moment something fell off, Danny would run. He'd run and figure out another plan. But for now, he had a bed to lay in and the promise of breakfast in the morning. It was enough, and it was a start. He lay down and shifted into a position that didn't strain against his slowly dissolving staples. A problem for morning time, Danny. Sandy's words echoed in his ears. All children deserve to be safe and loved. His heart ached, but he would not cry. Danny stared off into the darkness of the shelter. He knew what it was like to be safe, to be loved. The Fentons had not been perfect parents. They were messy and often erratic, scatterbrained at best, mostly concerned with their work rather than the two children who lived under the roof. Not to mention that the ambient ectoplasm that leaked in the laboratory was arguably not conducive to a healthy environment to raise children. But by the observance, despite everything, Danny had been safe with them. Child-proof locks had been installed on every door under Jazz's careful instruction. Growing up, neither Danny nor his elder sister were allowed in the basement. They brought a booster seat when they realized Danny was too small to sit in their vehicle unassisted. They made sure he was up to date on his shots, checking to make sure he had no allergies when it became clear that Danny himself had no idea. The Fentons would check on Danny in the middle of the night, had sat with him when he shook with soundless terror from his nightmares. Jack wrapped his cuts with surprising care, smoothing ointment on Danny's various bruises. Maddie would take the first bite of every food when she noticed he wouldn't eat until she did. They didn't pry into his life before them. To Jack and Maddie, all that mattered was the here and now. All that mattered was their time with Daniel. The Fentons had loved Danny in their own crazy scientist way, but it had always felt conditional. They would love Danny as long as he was their little boy, a fragile, mute child they found in an orphanage. Their love depended on the image of Danny, the idea of Daniel Jack Fenton. It was an identity he took on, so many masks he had worn in the 8 years of his life before. Like that identity, their love felt temporary and fleeting. It took their death for him to realize they had loved him even when he wasn't exactly as promised. Would they have loved him if they knew the full truth of who he was, of the things he had done? But Danny knew real, unconditional, unending love. The kind of love he remembered late at night when he stared up at the starry sky, clinging to the phantom feeling of a child's pinky intertwined with his, the names of constellations on his breath. A kind of love that came from feeling whole. Love that Danny had not felt in the 7 years. Hello. I'd just like to say thank you for listening to the end of the video. I really do appreciate it. This podfic is the first of quite a few in a series I'm planning on recording, and I don't know if you were able to notice me getting sick in the second half of the video, so apologies for that. Also, I'm entering a bit of a busy season with my extracurriculars, lots of traveling over the weekends and the like. I'm not yet sure if that will slow my video production rate, but anyways, if you enjoyed the podfic, you can leave me a like, maybe subscribe. Also, if you have requests for fic you'd like me to read, please leave a comment to let me know. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. Until next time, this is Poltergeist, signing off.